In December 1933, an 18-year-old boy sat broke in a cold London attic, listening to the rain, having just been thrown out of school for holding a girl's hand. He had no money, no plan, and no prospects. So he decided to do something completely mad. He would walk, on foot, across the whole of Europe, from the coast of Holland to the walls of Constantinople, sleeping in ditches and in castles, on a single pound a week. And what he found on that road was the strangest kind of wealth. Everywhere he went, penniless, strangers fed him, warmed him, took him in. He was walking through the last golden winter of an old continent, a Europe about to be swallowed by the dark. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. This book never gets him there. It stops dead on a bridge, mid-sentence. Stay, and you'll understand why that ending is perfect. Patrick Leigh Fermor was not a promising young man. He was a wild, dreamy troublemaker who had been expelled from one school after another, the last time for being caught holding hands with a greengrocer's daughter. By the end of 1933, he was 18, adrift in London, out of money and out of ideas, drinking away his allowance among older, cleverer friends. And then, lying in a rented room in the rain, the whole shape of his future suddenly arrived in a single flash. He would abandon London and England altogether and set out across Europe like a tramp, like a pilgrim, sleeping rough, living on bread and cheese and the odd mug of beer. He wrote the words down, almost drunk on them. A new life, freedom, something to write about. The failure had just become an escape. His kit was gloriously wrong for the task. A greatcoat, hobnailed boots, a volume of Horace's odes, a sleeping bag, and letters of introduction he'd half forgotten. Money would come as £1 a week, sent ahead to post offices down the route. On a wet December afternoon, he walked to Tower Bridge and climbed aboard a small Dutch steamer bound for the Hook of Holland. The rain came down in sheets. "Nice weather for young ducks," the taxi driver had told him, and the phrase stuck. Watching the lights of London slide away into the storm, he felt no fear at all, only an enormous, ringing gladness. Most travelers begin a journey from an edge, a port, a frontier. He was starting from the very heart of the city he was fleeing, walking outward toward a name that sounded like the end of the world. He came ashore in Holland before dawn, into a landscape sheeted with snow and silence. In a small cafe, he ate fried eggs and drank a scalding glass of gin, and later called that breakfast the formal start of his journey. And what a country to begin in. Fermor discovered he already knew Holland by heart, not from maps, but from paintings. Every canal, every gabled house, every skater cutting across the frozen polder looked lifted straight out of a Dutch old master. An ice yacht went tearing past over the ice like a winged dragon. He was 24 hours into a walk of over 1,000 miles, and the world had already turned into a gallery he could step inside. But it wasn't only beautiful. The great church he sketched at Rotterdam would be bombed to fragments within the decade, the first quiet note of a music that runs through the whole book. The problem with walking across Europe on £1 a week is simple. Where do you sleep? Fermor solved it almost by accident on his very first nights. He knocked at an inn in Dordrecht, and the landlady, seeing a soaked and shivering boy, refused to take a penny for the room. It was, he wrote, the first marvelous instance of a kindness and hospitality that would happen again and again for the rest of the road. He learned to sleep in village police cells, in barns, in workhouses, wherever a roof was offered, and he learned the magic password. His passport said student, and that single word, he said, became an amulet and an open sesame, the key that unlocked doors, meals, and beds all across a continent. Poverty, it turned out, was not an obstacle. It was an introduction. Then he crossed a frontier, and the light changed. He walked into Germany under a red flag with a black swastika at its center, into the country that had, that very year, handed itself to Adolf Hitler. In the border town, he passed a shop window arranged like an altar. Brown party uniforms, daggers, belts, and portraits of the new leader, all lovingly displayed. That night, through the falling snow, he watched a column of stormtroopers march past singing, torches burning, boots ringing on the cobbles. He was an English boy who had grown up on comic book Germans, and none of it felt real. But the swastika kept reappearing, on armbands, on flags, in the eyes of strangers. The most beautiful country on his route was also, he slowly understood, the most dangerous, and he was walking straight into its heart. The thing that unsettled Fermor most about Nazi Germany was not its cruelty, it was its charm. In a warm, low-beamed inn one evening, a table of stormtroopers began to sing, and they sang gloriously, old folk songs in rich, rolling harmony, the kind of music that goes straight to the chest. He sat and listened, moved almost to tears. And that was the horror of it. Because at that very moment, he wrote, the charm made it impossible to connect these singers with organized bullying, with the smashing of Jewish shop windows, and with the nocturnal bonfires of books. The men making that heartbreaking sound were the same men doing those things. It is the moral engine of the entire journey. Beauty and barbarism sharing one room, one voice, one country. He was seeing it with his own young eyes, 6 years before the world would. For all its menace, Germany also gave him some of his warmest days. In Cologne, near Christmas, 2 young men befriended the wandering Englishman and swept him home. For the first time, he sat in a proper German middle-class household, a scholar's study lined with books, coffee, and cake and cigars. Long talk about poetry late into the night. It was the exact opposite of the marching in the streets, and both were true at once. Fermor had a gift that money could never buy. People simply liked him. He could quote poetry in 3 languages, listen with his whole face, and turn a stranger's kitchen into a party by midnight. Over and over, this is what kept him alive, not the pound a week, which he mostly drank, but his own reckless, radiant charm. He arrived a beggar and left, always, a friend. He talked his way onto a barge chugging up the frozen Rhine, and it became one of the happiest stretches of the walk. The crew were 2 magnificently drunk bargemen who adopted him instantly, and for days he glided past cliffs and castles and vineyards white with snow, warm below deck, while Germany slid by like a pageant. But even here, the shadow leaned in. At one supper, a professor's widow spoke quietly, bitterly, about what was happening to her country, how friendships and families were breaking apart all over Germany, split down the middle by the new regime. Fermor was beginning to understand that the fairy tale scenery he loved was laid over something rotten and rising. Then the bargeman put him ashore at Koblenz with a hangover and a handshake, and he shouldered his pack and walked on into the cold. Christmas Eve found him in the little Rhine town of Bingen, taken in yet again by an innkeeper and his daughters. They fed him, and they let him help decorate the tree, and at midnight the whole town spilled out of the church into the snow to wish each other well. On Christmas morning, the smallest daughter shyly handed him a present, a single tangerine and a packet of cigarettes, wrapped beautifully in tinsel and silver paper. He had nothing to give her back, and it stung him for years afterward. But he never forgot the moment, and he gave it 3 words that would become the title of everything: the time of gifts. That is what the whole journey was. A boy who owned nothing, moving through a world that kept handing him its warmth, its wine, its wonders, asking for nothing in return but that he notice. In Heidelberg, he found the inn of his dreams, the Red Ox, a centuries-old student tavern run by the Spengel family, who folded him into their New Year celebrations as if he were a returning son. He drank, sang, and scribbled with the students. It was pure, golden happiness. Years later, in a footnote, Fermor tells you that young Fritz Spengel, who had greeted him so warmly, would be killed in the war in Norway in 1940. The book is full of these small, devastating time bombs. And at a nearby table one night, an albino stranger leaned over and delivered a snarling speech about how the weak, sick Germany would soon be made strong and pure again. "Adolf Hitler will change all that," the man said. "Perhaps you've heard the name?" Fermor smiled politely and moved on. He had, in fact, heard the name. Fermor's genius was that he could be a filthy vagabond one night and a dinner guest the next. In Stuttgart, 2 young women found him half frozen and smuggled him into their flat to clean him up. The comedy of it delighted him, a penniless tramp being scrubbed and dressed for smart society. At a grand industrialist dinner, he was introduced under a false, respectable name. And when the real story threatened to spill, the whole table dissolved into a farce of coughs and quick handshakes to cover for him. He slid between worlds like this the entire way, cellar to castle, hayloft to salon, and everyone was in on the delicious secret. He was learning the great truth of the road, that a good story and good manners will carry a man further than a full wallet ever could, and cost him nothing but the telling. At the old city of Ulm, something happened that quietly changed the whole shape of his journey. He came over a rise and saw for the first time the Danube. This was the river he had been walking toward without quite knowing it, the great highway that flows east across the whole of Europe, past Vienna, past Budapest, all the way down toward the Black Sea and Constantinople itself. From here on, the Danube would be his companion and his guide, looping and doubling, but always pulling him onward. Standing on the bridge at Ulm, staring down at that gray, powerful water, the far-off name at the end of his walk stopped being a fantasy and became a direction. He could almost feel the current tugging at him, saying the same thing his own restless heart kept saying: east, keep going east. Then, in Munich, everything went wrong. The city was thick with stormtroopers and forced salutes, and Fermor threw himself into its most famous refuge, the vast, roaring Hofbräuhaus beer hall. He drank, by his own account, a brooding, cylindrical liter of Teutonic myth, and then several more, until a kindly carpenter had to wheel him home to the youth hostel like a barrow of bricks. He woke with a monstrous headache to a far worse discovery. His rucksack was gone, and with it went everything: his passport, his money, and, most painful of all, the diary in which he had been recording every step of the journey. A pimpled fellow lodger had simply picked it up and walked out in one stupid night. The boy who owned almost nothing had lost even that. Losing the money and the passport was a disaster he could fix. Losing the diary was something else. Those pages held his only record of the first snowbound weeks. The exact words, the small details, the things a memory blurs and drops. Writing this book more than 40 years later, as an old man, Fermor still felt the loss like a physical ache. The loss of the journal he wrote still aches now and then like an old wound in bad weather. It's worth stopping on this because it tells you what kind of book you're actually reading. This is not a young man's diary. It is an old man reaching back across 4 decades, rebuilding a vanished continent and a vanished self out of memory, imagination, and longing. Every golden scene is also an act of mourning for a world he could never walk back into. Stranded and broke in Munich, Fermor did the only thing he could. He threw himself on the mercy of others. And here the great theme of the book blazed at its brightest. He went to the British consul, a busy official with no reason to care about a ragged runaway, who looked him over and said, "His Majesty's government will lend you a $5. Send it back sometime when you're less broke." Then a family of exiled White Russians, the Lifharts, took the disaster-struck boy in, re-outfitted him head to toe, and pressed on him a beautiful 17th century edition of Horace that he carried like a sacred object for the rest of the trip. He had lost everything, and the world had simply refilled his hands. The time of gifts, again, arriving exactly when he had nothing left at all. The road was not all warmth and wine, and the book is honest about its danger. Pushing on through the Bavarian mountains in the deep of winter, Fermor slept where he could, in barns, in charity beds handed out by village priests, among woodcutters who shared their fire. One night, walking between villages as the snow came down, he lost the path entirely. The cold began to work on him, the drowsy, dangerous warmth that is the last thing many frozen men ever feel. He was, he admitted plainly, not far from lying down and dying in a drift. He fought his way to a light and a door just in time. It's easy to romanticize a young man walking across Europe. Fermor lets you feel the other side of it too. The nights the beautiful road nearly killed the boy who loved it. Before he left Germany, Fermor stumbled into a scene that stayed with him forever. In a Rhineland attic, a man showed off his private shrine, and it was a shrine to the New Order, complete with a pistol laid out like a relic. But the man cheerfully admitted that a year or two earlier he had been a devoted communist in the opposite camp entirely. Now he wore the swastika with the same fervor. "I was astonished," the man laughed. "How easily they all change sides." Fermor recorded it without comment. but the meaning is unmistakable. He was watching an entire society slide its beliefs on and off like coats, watching decency evaporate, not with a bang, but with a shrug. Then he crossed the river into Austria, past the last swastika at the border, and the air, for a little while, felt easier to breathe. In Austria, the journey changed its music again. Now Fermor began to be passed, like a treasure, from one great country house to the next, schlosses full of frail old counts and countesses, the last, gentle survivors of the vanished Habsburg Empire. In one, a courtly old man, delighted to have a young guest, fussed over the wines and knocked over a glass of Tokay with a trembling hand. These were people living in the afterglow of a world that had already ended in 1918, surrounded by portraits and titles and traditions with no country left to hold them up. Fermor, the sacked schoolboy, was treated as an honored equal in rooms like museums, and he understood even then that he was one of the last outsiders ever to see this fading aristocracy alive, a whole civilization, candlelit, waiting quietly for the end. Not everyone he met was noble or grand, and some of the finest hours came from pure eccentrics. On the Danube, he fell in with a self-taught genius he called the polymath, a man who could, at the drop of a hat, mime the way a giant catfish swallows its prey, then launch without pausing into a dazzling, sweeping lecture on the migrations of tribes across ancient Europe, then hum you the whole of Schubert's Trout Quintet. Fermor sat spellbound. This is the quiet joy that runs under all the walking. He was insatiably, gloriously curious, in love with languages, history, architecture, folklore, and above all, with the strange people who carry such things around inside them. He wasn't just crossing distance, he was collecting the world, every song, every legend, every odd, brilliant mind, and storing it up for the book he didn't yet know he'd spend his life writing. The high point of the Austrian Danube, in every sense, was the Abbey of Melk. Fermor climbed up to the great baroque monastery, all gold and marble and swirling painted ceilings, blazing above the river, and was shown around by a young monk his own age. He fell completely under its spell. Melk, he wrote, is high noon, ceremonious and jocund, drenched in meridian glory. After the snowbound danger and the political dread of the German weeks, here was Europe at its most confident and radiant, a civilization singing its own praises in stone and light. For a boy raised on the gray ruins of English abbeys, dissolved and roofless for 400 years, to walk into a living, gilded, working monastery like this was overwhelming. It was the kind of beauty that makes you believe, for an afternoon, that the world is good and will last. It's worth remembering how young he still was, because the book never lets you forget it. On his 19th birthday, staying with yet another kind aristocratic family, Fermor did something purely, cringingly adolescent. Overwhelmed by their generosity and desperate not to overstay, he invented a train he had to catch, a train that did not exist, just to escape the awkwardness of being cared for. Then, flustered and grand, he overtipped their chauffeur with money he didn't have. It's a small, funny, human moment, and Fermor, the old writer, includes it with a wince and a smile at his younger self. For all his charm and his poetry, this was still a teenager. Proud, clumsy, terrified of imposing, learning the hard grammar of gratitude one embarrassment at a time. The road was not just showing him Europe, it was slowly, patiently, making him into a man. He came down at last toward Vienna, the old imperial capital, the glittering prize of Central Europe, and walked straight into a war. In February 1934, as he arrived, the city erupted into civil conflict, the army shelling the great workers' housing blocks while gunfire echoed through the streets. Once again, the pattern of the whole book, Fermor reaching for beauty and finding violence waiting inside it. Cold, broke, and shut out of a city tearing itself apart. He found shelter in a Salvation Army hostel among the genuinely destitute. The romance of the road had thinned to something bleaker. A 19-year-old with empty pockets, sleeping in a charity dormitory while a European capital bled a few streets away. And yet, even here, even now, Vienna was about to hand him one of the great friendships of the entire journey. In the hostel, he met Konrad, a gentle, elderly wanderer from the Frisian Islands who spoke in the most extraordinary way, Courtly, old-fashioned English studded with quotations. "I hope your slumbers were peaceful," Conrad would ask him in the morning, "and mated with quiet dreams." The two penniless men became fast friends, and Conrad solved Fermor's money problem with a brilliant scheme. The boy could draw, so he sent him door to door through the apartment buildings of Vienna, offering to sketch portraits for a few coins. Fermor went from flat to flat, and behind each door found a different fragment of the old Habsburg mosaic. Poles, Serbs, Jews, Hungarians, aristocrats, and clerks. The whole vanished multinational empire crammed into one stairwell. He earned his bread with a pencil, and in doing so drew a portrait of a city and a world that was only years from disappearing. Somewhere in Vienna, Fermor stopped and did the sums. He had walked around 750 miles in roughly 62 days, on foot, in winter, on almost no money. And he was still only about a third of the way to Constantinople. Every atlas whispered temptations. Italy lay just over the Alps, warm and famous and close. But he held his line. The vow was to walk east along the Danube, and east he would go. It tells you who he was becoming. The impulsive boy who fled London on a whim had grown, mile by mile, into someone with a discipline of his own. Not the schools, not his father's, but a private, stubborn faithfulness to the strange promise he'd made himself in a rainy attic. He would keep the shape of the thing. He would earn the ending, whatever it turned out to be. Leaving Vienna, Fermor crossed another invisible line, out of the German-speaking world and into the world of the Slavs, at Bratislava, on the Danube. Everything shifted. New languages, new alphabets, new faces. Here Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, and Jews lived layered together in the same steep old streets. He wandered into the Jewish quarter, into coffee houses full of scholars arguing over ancient texts, into a whole rich culture, centuries deep. And this is the part that aches to read now, because Fermor is writing with hindsight, and he knows that almost all of this, the languages, the communities, the faces in the coffee house, would be annihilated within a decade. He is drawing them tenderly, precisely, lovingly, as a man draws the face of someone he knows is about to die. The whole book, you realize, is an elegy walking. Then he did something that broke his own rule. Offered a lift, he detoured backwards, west, away from Constantinople, to spend a few snowbound days in Prague. He couldn't resist it, and neither can the book. Fermor breaks off and simply says, "We shall never get to Constantinople like this. I know I ought to be moving on, but I can't." Prague enchanted him utterly, a city he saw wreathed in snow like a smoke ring and the paper lattice of a valentine. He climbed through its Gothic cathedral and its ancient astonishments, wandered the old Jewish ghetto with its legends of the golem, and chased a delightful literary puzzle about Shakespeare giving Bohemia a coastline it never had. It is the most self-indulgent chapter in the book, and he knows it, and he doesn't care. Some gifts you stop and unwrap slowly. Back on the Danube, in Slovakia, something quietly miraculous happens to the book itself. Remember the diary stolen in Munich? Fermor had kept writing a new one, and this later notebook, the Green Diary, survived. He lost it in Romania in 1939, and then, decades later, astonishingly recovered it. So from this point on, the old writer is no longer working from memory alone. He is holding the actual penciled words of his 19-year-old self, and he splices them into the text. The two voices meet on the page, the boy who walked it and the man remembering him. In this stretch, he stays with a cultured old baron who reads Proust aloud by the fire and gently tells the youth to stop calling him sir. Spring is arriving, the snow is melting off the great river, and the boy is nearly a man. As Easter neared, Fermor walked into the marches of Hungary and into one of the most haunting scenes in the whole book. In a village church on the Thursday of Holy Week, he watched the ancient service of Tenebrae, where the candles are put out one by one, verse by verse, until the whole congregation is left standing together in total darkness. In that dark, for a strange moment, the gathered villagers seemed to him to fuse into something older and wilder than a church crowd. It was the kind of raw, medieval Europe that England had long since lost. And earlier that day, a small, perfect grace note, a red-haired Jewish baker, seeing the boy's boot falling apart, had simply mended it for him. One more unbought kindness. From one more soul the coming years would try to erase. And then, near the end, the boy finally received the gift he hadn't known he was walking toward. One warm spring night by the Danube, for the first time in the whole journey, Fermor slept out in the open. No inn, no barn, no roof, no host. Just a young man, the riverbank, and the enormous sky. And he was flooded with a happiness so pure he could barely hold it. He lay, he wrote, deep in one of those protracted moments of rapture, which scatter this journey like asterisks. Part of the joy, he realized, was that nobody on earth knew where he was. No school, no father, no address, no expectation. Just him, free and hidden and alive under the stars, with a blood-red moon rising over the marshes. This was the whole point. This was what he had walked 1,000 miles to feel. The road had one last joke for him. Tramping the border country in his ragged coat, sunburnt and wild-haired, Fermor was suddenly arrested by frontier guards, who were convinced he was a notorious local smuggler, a saccharine runner they'd been hunting, known as Black Joe. They marched him in, delighted with their catch. Then someone opened his battered passport, saw the word English, and the whole thing collapsed into laughter. The dangerous smuggler was just a daft young Englishman walking to Constantinople for no reason anyone could fathom. They let him go with grins and shrugs. It's a tiny scene, but it catches something true about the entire journey. How odd, how harmless, how gloriously pointless it all looked from the outside, and how, from the inside, it was the most important thing this boy would ever do. And now the ending. Fermor climbs onto the long bridge over the Danube that carries the road from Slovakia into Hungary, and he stops. It is the eve of Easter. Above him, great flocks of storks are streaming north across the evening sky. On the far bank, Hungarian noblemen in old costume are gathering for the festival. He leans on the rail, suspended between two countries, in what he calls no man's air, and the church bells begin to ring. And there the book simply stops. 2 words, to be continued. He is hundreds of miles short of Constantinople. He will not reach it in this book or the next. The old man died before finishing the story. But that is why the ending is perfect. The boy is still on the bridge, forever, in the last light of a Europe about to vanish, walking toward the bells, not wanting to be late. That was the time of gifts,